Sam, if I asked you to describe Amsterdam in 3 words, which 3 words come to mind?
Well, Adam, at the risk of having a Charles Barkley moment, I'm going to give you 3 phrases instead of 3 words. Tall people, incredible infrastructure, legal drugs.
I don't know who Charles Barkley is, but pretty strong start with the description. Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we examine protests, revolutions, social movements, try and unpick some learnings for better wisdom on how to fight the good fight. My name's Adam, and with me is a man who I have never, to my knowledge, seen ride a bicycle. Sam, how are you doing today?
It's true. I think I've ridden a bike twice in the last 20 years, maybe.
I've had 4 bike journeys today.
Well, let's say 2 times in the last 15 years.
Damn.
Yeah, I mean, riding a bike can be fairly futile on these American roads because, you know, even if you ride 2 miles down the road, you haven't hit the shops yet.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. We are going to be talking about bikes here today, but first we have some congratulations to issue. Not entirely sure when this episode is going to go out. By my calculations, possibly the 29th of June, in which case, congratulations to the Seychelles on your Independence Day. But as of recording, which is on the 18th of May, we have a very unusual Independence Day this week.
Do tell.
Norway.
Okay. Independence from who, Adam?
So, on the 17th of May, 1884, Norway gained independence from Denmark.
Okay.
But it wasn't exactly an empire colony situation. It was more like a sort of co-kingdom within the Kingdom of Denmark, with like strong sort of autonomous rights, almost as if Scotland was declaring independence from the UK. Sort of similar vibes to that, I guess.
No, that is a different story, my English friend.
But in this, well, maybe so. But the point is, the reason that this happened is that Denmark, or Denmark-Norway, as it was called then, had declared neutrality, armed neutrality in the Napoleonic Wars. And so Britain did a quick invasion to basically, I think, just launch attacks from Denmark, or it was to capture Danish naval ships, basically, for the use against Napoleon, and forced Denmark-Norway into a treaty where Norway was going to be ceded to Sweden, basically. And so Norway declared independence before that, and then they formed a joint union of equal nations, which lasted until 1905 with the Treaty of Kiel. So this is all very convoluted and of very, very little consequence, either historically or to the people who live there, frankly. But congratulations, Norway.
What's important is that the British were still somehow involved. Happy Divorce Day, Norway.
So, Sam, today we're going to be talking about bikes, specifically how Amsterdam got its groove back, how Amsterdam became the cycling capital of the world. Why are we talking about this, Sam? What do you think? Why do you think we're going to be talking about this?
I'm coming into this podcast fairly blind on the topic. As you know, I have very little experience with bicycles. And I'm assuming some protest and maybe a heart of revolution within some people's soul is lit on this topic. I know that the Dutch are very proud of their bicycle culture and love their bikes in general. Yeah,
so that's true. Cycling is a very important part of Dutch culture, and there certainly were big protest movements that led to the situation that we find ourselves in now. But more than that, I think that bicycles are the ultimate symbol of freedom.
Wow. It's not a Ford F-150 lifted.
No, it's more difficult to murder children on a bicycle. However, the best explanation for why bicycles are the ultimate symbol of freedom actually comes from a green text from 4chan from years ago, which points out that bicycles are almost completely unregulated, incompatible with traffic jams, no insurance is needed, no license is needed. It's fueled with whatever you had for breakfast and your own grit, goes as far as you can. You chain it anywhere there's a sturdy post. Even if someone does steal it, it's very cheap. You can replace it. Much safer. Collisions much less likely to kill you. It's good for you, and it's a good time. Bicycles are the ultimate symbol of freedom.
All right, you've got me on that one. You know, I have always wondered when I'm watching like a zombie apocalypse movie or TV show, why they're not using bicycles. They're either in cars or on horseback, but I suppose it's just bikes don't look as cool.
So, cycling in the Netherlands is huge. The Netherlands is the cycling capital of the world. I thought that maybe this was exaggerated. Maybe there'd be some smaller places that have high cycling levels, but no. The Netherlands is by far the biggest cycling country in the world. 27% of all journeys in the Netherlands are taken by bicycle, as well as half of all journeys to the train station for train journeys, and nearly half of all journeys to school or work in cities. 27% of all journeys being by bike is compared to 2% of all journeys in the United Kingdom and 1% in the United States.
I'm shocked it's 1% in the US. I don't believe that. I think they rounded up from 0.
Well, possibly, but regardless, the next highest country on this list is Denmark, where about 18% of all journeys are taken by bicycle.
Can I ask you, because I think some listeners could use some context here. I mean, with Denmark as well. The weather in the Netherlands is terrible.
Yes, the weather is terrible. Although we have had a remarkable run of good weather recently. I know I can't go an episode without talking about the weather in the Netherlands, but it is on our minds a lot. The weather is terrible, but we have 2 sayings in the Netherlands which sort of remove this as a point. One of which is, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. And the second, if someone's complaining, especially a child is complaining about going out in the rain, you say, you're not made of sugar.
Nice. Well, I guess my point on that is just that it's remarkable that so many bike journeys are taken in often the rain or the snow.
Yeah, it's true. We don't get a ton of snow anymore in the Netherlands, but certainly a lot in the rain. And something I realized from being caught in the rain on my bike, and this is just a piece of life advice for the listeners, if you ever are caught in the rain without the proper gear on a bicycle, or indeed, I suppose, hiking or whatever, try and get fully wet as quickly as possible. Because once you reach the point where you can't actually get any wetter than you already are, it's like a weight is lifted from your shoulders. You just revel in the freedom of submitting to the elements in this case.
Good advice. I'll try it one day if I ever see rain again.
Or a bicycle. I think the other thing that's important to note about bikes and freedom, and why we talk about in this episode, is as a matter of justice. Road accidents are the 9th leading cause of death globally, responsible for around 1.34 million deaths annually. At least that was true in 2016, which is when this data is from. So things could have changed, but wasn't that long ago. It's become something of a meme in leftist circles that when you're talking about bike infrastructure, and particularly leftist urbanist circles online in particular, cities will often give us an excuse. You know, we're not Amsterdam. We can't build the cycling infrastructure that they have. And the meme is that Amsterdam wasn't either in the 1970s. And pictures go around of how clogged with cars Dutch cities were in the 60s and 70s, and they certainly were. And so there were a series of protests that went into effect to build this. The picture is actually a bit more complicated than that. It was a little bit hard to work out how to structure this episode. A whole lot of things happened all at the kind of the same time in the 60s and the 70s in the Netherlands, which led to the development of the kind of cycling state that we have now. But I think I'm going to try and go roughly in chronological order, highlighting some of the key players in this movement, and then we can have a discussion about all of that. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Question that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the episode, and just as we're talking about all of this, is really, what is politics and how should it play into activism? This is something that I think will come up often enough throughout this podcast, throughout this episode, and I think it's worth thinking on as we go. The story of biking in the Netherlands starts really in the 1960s. The Netherlands was following a trend that was happening all throughout Europe of fewer and fewer journeys being taken by bicycle. If you look into the 30s and 40s, the uptake in cycling rose massively, and like many journeys were taken by bike. In fact, I'm going to send you an image right now. This is a percentage of journeys taken by bike by city from 1920 until 2015, and there are 14 cities throughout Europe on this list.
We will include this on the YouTube edit for any of our listeners that would like to take a look. Walk me through this graph, Adam, if you will.
Sure. So there are 14 European cities on this graph, and examine cycling rates for them between 1920 and 2015. And some of them started from quite a high place in 1920. If you look at, for example, Enschede, which is a small Dutch city, like 90% of journeys in 1920 were taken by bicycle. But for all of these cities, all throughout Europe, this rate starts to fall off pretty massively around 1950, in the mid-1950s. And then sort of plateauing for many of them around the mid-1970s. This was a phenomenon that happened all throughout Europe. And in the Netherlands, this came a little bit later. This came in sort of the mid-60s as opposed to the 50s, because the Netherlands was quite slow to mass car adoption. They had much lower rates of car ownership than many other comparable European countries. In the Netherlands in 1960, 45 out of every 1,000 people had a car. In Belgium, that was like high 80s. In Switzerland, it was like in the 90s. And in the US, it was like 350 per 1,000. And this was in part because until the 1960s, there was wage control in the Netherlands, but like a maximum wage control. So national wages would not be increased unless there was an agreement between the government and trade union lobby group, basically. It was a group of trade unions, corporations, etc., and the government. They would all meet together and decide how wages were going to increase, and it kept wages fairly low in the Netherlands. And then this was removed in the 60s. People got richer. As car adoption increased throughout the Netherlands, traffic accidents and pollution increased as well. And by the peak of this, in 1972, more than 3,500 people in the Netherlands were killed in traffic accidents, including like 450 kids in 1972.
And it looks like, based on this graph, that 1972 seems to be quite a pivotal time for an uptick in bicycle use.
Yeah, so in 1972, as a response to largely children dying in 1972, a huge protest movement in the Netherlands started called Stop de Kindermoord. And Stop de Kindermoord means stop child murder, basically. And this got kicked off after a journalist called Langenhoff, his daughter, who was 6 years old, was killed in a traffic accident. And he said this quote:
"Our society will never be just until a child can spontaneously run to meet his or her father without risking being run over by a car."
Stop de Kindermoord was the first massive pro-bike movement in the Netherlands. It had all kinds of protests. There's a very famous image of people taking their bicycles and lying down in the road that runs under the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the sort of largest, most institutional museum in Amsterdam, blocking traffic there. People would march with banners that said, "Stop de Kindermoord, stop child murder." A graveyard was set up, sort of mock graveyard with 150 crosses, where this was 150 people per month were being killed in the Netherlands in traffic accidents. Really quite evocative images. And this was a massive scale movement that drove to a lot of change.
Might I say, sitting here in the United States, that it sounds very refreshing that there is a country out there where child death invokes a response at all.
Yeah.
Sadly.
It did invoke a response, but it wasn't the first movement to question the role of cars in our society. That goes back a little bit earlier. I'm sort of already breaking the chronological order, but I think it makes sense. It goes back a little bit earlier to the 1960s. And actually the first challenge to the role of cars in cities came from Delft, the Dutch city of Delft. Delft is a small city, only like 100,000 people live there today. I'm not sure what their population was in the 60s, but not a big place, but a very old place. Because of all the traffic and pollution that was building up in these small Dutch cities, groups in Delft started to propose what was called a woonerf, living streets. And the living streets, they had some demands for. Basically, that pedestrians could use the full width of the road, so you wouldn't have a distinction in height between the road and the sort of sidewalk. They were all one surface. They would have features which reduced the speed of traffic going through there, and that people driving through a woonerf would not be allowed to drive faster than a walking pace. So that's like 5 miles an hour, basically. About 10 kilometers an hour, usually in these little spaces. This was backed by some academics at the university in Delft, and this was sort of the first thing that started to get city urban planning attention, partly because it had the legitimacy of this academic backing. At the same time, in the later 60s and into the early 70s, there were two groups of anarchists called the Provos. That was the name of their newspaper, short provocation, Provos. And then that went defunct in like 1979 and was replaced by another newsletter called the Kabouters, which means the Goblin. And the Kabouters and the Provosts really were not about car infrastructure. They launched a plan for an initiative called the White Bicycle Plan, which suggested basically shared cycling, like lots of cities have now. Like in London, it's the Boris bikes, right? But you see Lime bikes and whatever all throughout every cities. Yeah, and these would be free. And this was a suggestion of these groups in the 60s. Then they did these various art pieces as well. An artist called Yoshio Nakajima did a performance in Shidam where he would pour water and red paint over himself while standing on the wreck of a car, and then other people in the performance would basically destroy it with metal poles even further. Really eye-catching stuff. In around 1970, there were a group of students at the University of Rotterdam in the architecture school who started a new group called Duivar, which means the dead stork. The stork is the symbol of the city, The Hague, and they took like an architectural academic stance for arguing that cities should prioritize low-car infrastructure, and cities started instituting low-car zones in their city centres. Amersfoort did that quite early. Utrecht started doing that in sort of mid-1960s, as did Groningen and Enschede. A downside of this episode is it's going to have a lot of Dutch in it like that.
Well, at least you have some practice.
A little bit. We're almost through the cast of characters. There are a few more. In the 1970s, pro-bike, anti-car movements had grown to such a degree that the Dutch Cycling Union established itself. 20,000 people were members of the Dutch Cycling Union. They launched pamphlets that basically told people how to make demands to the government. They said, you need to have good contacts with city council members, and you basically need to collect data from people moving through the city. So in Amersfoort, the group distributed 3,000 questionnaires about issues that cyclists were facing on their journey, what was stressful, what was dangerous, etc. They got 300 responses, and that was seen as the legitimacy for how they got involved with the Dutch government. It was actually very persuasive, succeeded in persuading a lot of politicians, a lot of people rallied against it, and as a result, the Dutch Cycling Commission, now it's called Tour de Force, is a pretty much universally approved policy throughout the Netherlands, and they are pushing a further 20% uptick in cycling rates by 2027.
How are they doing?
Not well, but we'll come to that in a moment.
Okay.
This is sort of the basic historical context for everything that went on in the Netherlands at this time. What jumps out at you from all of this sort of melange of things?
Well, part of it, I think, for further context for our listeners in the wider scope of what we usually talk about, the numbers seem fairly low when you're talking about the Netherlands compared to another country, but that's to note that the Netherlands is a lot smaller of a place, and it had a lower population back in the 60s as well. So it seemed like the threshold to make an impact, at least during this time, wasn't as high as it would be today to air your grievances. What jumps out is how fast this seemed to take, how a lot of the cities jumped on board. And I think maybe this is something that's been in the back of my head as well. I know that the Netherlands doesn't have a huge auto manufacturing industry, which has been a large factor in the American way of life since the cars were invented, and why suburbs and these walkable cities don't exist, but the suburbs thrive. Whereas maybe it was a bit, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe it was a bit easier for the politicians to get on board with these initiatives when there wasn't a monetary stake in the country's economy to switch away from a car lifestyle to a more cyclist one.
So possibly the relationship of the politicians in the Netherlands to this issue is key to what's going on here, but that has more to do with the structure of Dutch electoral politics than it does about any particular auto industry. It's true that there aren't a lot of Dutch car brands, but actually there is still a fair amount of car manufacturing in the Netherlands, and there was in the 1960s and 70s. Not huge, but substantial.
Okay.
I think that a few things are important to know, and we can talk about the politics because I think that's where it gets interesting. One is that what happened in the 60s and 70s was not so much that the Netherlands massively adopted cycling. There was a slight uptick in the past few decades in cycling, but actually what happened was a decline that was happening all throughout Europe was stopped in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm. And that's back to that graph
Yeah.
we were looking at earlier.
Yeah, so it crashes out in the 60s and 70s and then kind of plateaus, rising slightly after that. This all works with Dutch electoral politics because in the Netherlands, we have proportional representation. And there are many, many political parties. The basic way it works is that you vote for a political candidate or a political party at a national level. All the votes for that party are counted up, and then they are proportionally divvied up. There are 150 seats in Parliament, so if you get 1/150th of the national vote in an election, you can have one seat at Parliament. So that means that the barrier to entry for a political party in the Netherlands is quite low. So more established parties were more on board with accepting these political demands and chasing cycling things because this was such a popular movement. Lots and lots of people supported cycling in the Netherlands, and it would have been very easy for seats to be taken away from larger parties based on this one very important issue.
Proportional representation, what a concept.
Yeah.
I think that's a reflection of how it does benefit the people.
Yeah. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The other is something that maybe got a little bit lost in the description, but is present when you pick it out, which is that the initial interest in cycling infrastructure in the Netherlands developed from these big showy movements, first from the Provo's and the Kabouters, and then from Stop de Kindermoord, these very evocative, eye-catching, quite traditional protests. But what succeeded in making change was that after these big showy protests had happened, more respectable groups, more traditionally, aesthetically at least, traditional groups such as the Dutch Cycling Union, established themselves as authorities within this field of knowledge and used the basis of things like gathering user data from the bottom up rather than the top down in order to communicate their legitimacy.
And do you think that, I guess, the more radicals showing their grievances was the catalyst for the more legitimate people in lawmaking?
Absolutely, I do, because in the Netherlands, you can sway votes in this way with a relatively small number of votes, right? 1/150th of all the votes cast is not a ton of votes. But you do have to get 1/150th of the population to turn up for this. And not only that, it's a bit more complicated than that because you need to be able to field candidates, right, in different localities because names still have to appear on the ballots, etc. You have to coordinate campaigns, make demands, etc., put manifestos together. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but a relatively low barrier to entry in that sense. And I think that these big showy movements that were particularly emotionally evocative really had an impact there. But the other thing that I think is interesting, and part of the reason why I said that it was important to bear in mind what politics is at the start of this, can be summed up in a quote that I have for you here from Martje van Patten, who is the founder of the Stop de Kindermoord movement.
We realized we were rather popular because everybody recognized it, the need to drop children traffic fatalities. The issue was non-political, so we were not made into a sort of struggle between left and right, or what have you. Everybody was agreeing on the issue.
This kind of brings me to my question. With all of this in mind, the effects of protests leading to more traditional modes of pursuing political persuasion, in combination with the fact that this was a massive appeal issue that, at least by its organisers, was thought of as non-political, what does this tell us about the role of politics and activism? What do we do with this as sort of outwardly political people when we have political agenda that back all of the kind of social movements we want to change, when you have this effect here that at least considered itself to be non-political?
Yeah, I think both you and I would probably agree that it was political. He describes it as non-political, but I think everything we do in life is political, including the declaration of non-politicalness. That is sort of an acceptance of the status quo and going along with the status quo, which is in itself a political thing to do, because politics, I think, is how we manifest the ideal world we want to live in. Mm-hmm. So for these people, the ideal world was a society with less children fatalities due to cars. Yeah. They were fighting that battle on a political stage because it was politics.
Yeah, I think there's something to that as well. But I suppose what I'm trying to tease out here is effective discussion around marketing tactics, around marketing strategies, in the sense that, say, you're in San Diego. Say we wanted San Diego to become the next great cycling capital of the world. As unlikely as that may or may not
seem. It's got the weather for it.
Well, say that was our goal, right? Do you think it makes sense to pursue an openly political project, or to try and negate at least the imagery of that politics, regardless of how we may personally feel about it?
No, I see where you're going with this now. I see what you mean, because I think something like climate change has been made very political these days, when objectively it's, not a right or left issue. It's a survival issue. And the fact that it has been made a polarizing point has diminished the impact humans have made towards combating it. So I see what you mean about marketing, because making it a, quote, non-political issue does appeal to everyone there. I look at my own country now, and I see a lot of issues that shouldn't be a disagreement, including child mortality, due to guns, due to cars, due to a lot of other things, but they pit one side against the other, amongst other issues like climate change as well. Back to your point of, if I were to go about making San Diego a more cycle-friendly city, there are initiatives to do this, but it is immediately made political, in the sense that conservatives really are obsessed with their cars here. And you described a bicycle as the epitome of freedom, and I joked that an F-150 was the epitome of freedom, but that is actually the perspective of a shocking number of people here. Now, more and more so, that those people would be having a Cybertruck instead. Ugh. But I think it would progress the issue and make it more tangible, and make it more appealing if it was portrayed as a non-political issue. But nowadays, I think we're pretty far past anything being non-political, where cycling is seen as environmentally conscious, so therefore it is left-wing, therefore half the population or more in America does not like it.
I can see how that would be the case, and the political structure in the United States is very different than the Netherlands, right? Not only does the Netherlands have this sort of proportional representation structure, but because it has this, no political party ever wins an election outright, always governed by coalition. Often quite tenuous coalitions, as we have at the moment, really very hanging on by a thread, as it has been for the whole year it's been in effect. But it means that big changes are hard to enact in the Netherlands. It lends itself to incremental change, and also quite technocratic, because we have this massive political structure here, civil servants don't change when the government changes. Okay. So the people actually sort of working to implement the policies are the same people for often years and years at a time.
Interesting.
And a civil service job in the Netherlands is very cushy. At my previous work, I had a colleague who had come from the Dutch civil service. She was 27, and as a 27-year-old, she had 45 annual vacation days as a civil servant.
That's working days, people, in America.
Yeah. That's 9 weeks of vacation. That's
incredible.
But I digress. These structures in the Netherlands do lend themselves to these kinds of effects, but I think that what can be really useful is to look at actually all of the different things that went into effect in order, because we kind of got lost in the historical goings-on of it there. But if you look at the actual steps that were taken by different levels of activists and civil servants and people advocating for bike policies, take the politics out of it for a second and just look at the objectives and the strategies that were used to obtain them.
Can I try to summarize so
you
can see what where maybe me and the listeners are at? So we had a majority of Dutch people using bikes pre-war, steeply declined until the 70s, but then during this time there were more radical advocacy groups, I guess, demonizing the car culture, and then different groups of still more radical protest movements where they would show demonstrations to sort of win hearts and minds amongst the general population. But then off the back of this, the lawmakers, at least some of them, were able to push this agenda into government, into policy, that city by city small measures were adopted. Is that where we're at? Am I missing anything?
Yeah, that's all broadly true, but I think I'm gonna isolate it even further. Sure. Basically. And there are some on here that I actually haven't even told you about yet, but they're sort of part of the larger movements. Right. So you had small-scale experiments in low-car streets in small cities. You had radical protesters who were writing urban planning documents, distributing them, causing a fuss for other causes as well, other kinds of protests, doing big showy art pieces, generally being quite annoying and public in the media. Then you have a massively popular protest movement based around an emotionally evocative image, children being killed. The thing that really allowed that to take off was that there was a documentary made which basically showed kids wanting to play in the streets. It was taken from like the kids' perspective, and it was really popular in the Netherlands. A critic said, "This film moved me deeply. The situation for the children living in this slowly decaying neighborhood was portrayed in a beautiful way through their own eyes." So that was very evocative. Then you had the formation of academic groups that were pushing for urban planning reforms, the Doivar in Rotterdam. Then you have basically a lobbying association, the Dutch Cycling Union, that not only advocated to people directly working in the government, they issued flyers throughout all Dutch cities which had explanations for how the local municipalities worked and how you could best lobby them to make changes on your behalf. So you would actually, in the leaflet, have a detailed breakdown of how your local government works, so you know how to influence that. And I think all of this stuff happening together is super interesting, because something that you've said quite a lot on episodes that maybe we haven't even released yet, but that has come up a few times for us talking, is about knowing your role in protests, right? So what do you think of all of these sort of things coming together like this? Are any that jump out as particularly effective or useful to take to other things or for other issues, or are some of them only applicable in a context like the Netherlands where the political structure is conducive to it?
I don't think it's exclusive to a country like the Netherlands where the democratic means are a bit more representative. But in this podcast, I think one of the goals, at least that I have for it, is to explore if there is a sort of formula to certain types of protests and how they can be successful. And I'm seeing a pattern here that we see fairly frequently when it comes to domestic protest, which is that there seems to be steps in which certain groups get involved, and then the effectiveness of that in general, with this being the people that are directly involved first, right? The ones that have lost their kids or know someone that has been killed by a car and wants to advocate for cycling. And then the students, the artists get involved, they grab this issue, they run with it. And then you have a higher level of professionals, right? These working professionals, these lobbyists that get involved before finally the politicians take action. And I see this here, and I wonder if it can be applied elsewhere. I think that, to answer your question, I know I give these explanations then answer your question at the end, but to answer your question, I think it can be implemented in a country like the United Kingdom or the United States, where there are far fewer choices politically. However, I think it would take a much higher threshold of people. For example, the past year plus, there have been massive protests in the UK in support of the people of Gaza. But even though tens of thousands of people march, weekly in London, it seems, that's not enough to get over that threshold, right?
Yeah, that's true. And actually, on the topic of Gaza, this is where the Netherlands, as an example of this, where it doesn't work quite as effectively, because there have also been massive protests for Gaza here, and yet no demands have been met, and actually the institutions have turned quite hostile towards this sort of thing. Perhaps that's because a lot of the, 1/3 of Amsterdam is not Dutch, and a lot of the international crowd has been a part of these protests. But, or maybe it's just another level of government. It's something that's less immediate for people, and it's more inherently political, I think.
It's a little surprising that one or two of the more fringe parties wouldn't take it up as a chance to gain more
I think they do, but I think that But that's sort of where my knowledge of Dutch politics falls apart a little bit, because I'm not eligible to vote here, so there's only a certain level of understanding that I have.
Yeah, he just makes a fuss. He's the one that the conservatives are complaining about.
I've had some conservatives yell at me in the street at protests or on my way to protests in English, but never mind about all that.
You're like, dang, how did they know?
Yeah.
Am I that obvious?
Yeah, there's something about the aura. But I have a little epilogue that sort of throws all of the stuff we've been talking to into a little bit of a question. Because we've talked about all of these tactics. We've talked about presenting it as non-political, and how that was actually very effective in driving change. And does it matter if it's not outwardly presented as political if it is effective in driving change? But I have a quote here for you from an academic paper that I read that was written by Henk Jan Dekker, who has written quite a lot about this time period, thanks to him.
The period between 1979 and 1988 is denoted as one of declining membership and declining activism. Membership of the Dutch Cycling Union dropped from nearly 20,000 to 13,000. At the same time, the union chose to work alongside government actors to develop and implement bicycle policies. This collaborative approach resulted in a drop in confrontational tactics and a reduction in the protests against the effects of increasing car traffic.
Do you remember a little while ago you asked me how the Dutch government was doing on trying to increase cycling rates by a further 20%?
I do remember.
The answer is not very well. They are not looking likely to meet those targets. Part of the action by the provers and the kabouters was complaining about the sort of technocratic approach to policymaking. This was actually shared not only by the radical anarchist groups, but by Doivar and by the Woon-Erf movement in Delft, which was that when you looked at these official city urban planners, they were planning with cars in mind. They were throwing lip service to bicycles, and they had very little expertise in cycling. And by collecting data from daily cyclists in these cities, that was the legitimacy that these movements had. They gathered this ground-up sort of counter-expertise. But now, the official policy of Tour de Force, the Dutch government cycling initiative, their project includes innovations like traffic signals that give shorter wait times to cyclists, bicycle highways, quote-unquote, that allow you to travel faster by bike. But the best cycling policy, researchers have found, is effectively an anti-car policy. The fewer cars you have, particularly in urban spaces, the more friendly to bikes your city is going to be. And whilst the Dutch are universally pro-bike, that does not extend as far as measures that might interfere with the level of driving that we have in the city. So whilst this tactic was very effective, largely as a result of being political early on and finding its way into the levers of power, the very act of it being successful released the pressure on this movement, and now it has stalled.
So what does that say about protest as a whole to you?
To me, I think it stresses the importance of... we almost went a whole episode without talking about Marx, but here we are.
I mean, it is Sunday. This is our church, you know, so...
It's about the dialectic, right? The sort of constant revolution, the idea that goals are never achieved, they are sort of iterated towards, to borrow the language of Silicon Valley. You are never going to solve it all in one go. Politics is not a destination, it is a journey. And I'm mixing my metaphors, but by playing the game, we change the rules.
So do you think that in the Netherlands today, there's a general consensus amongst the broader population that what we have is enough in terms of bike culture, and that there isn't a passion to fix those aspects that still may be broken about it?
So this is anecdotal, right? This is a vibe based just from living in Amsterdam for the past 3 years. Where I see bike culture sort of expanding is largely around the extension of the kind of dedicated cycle lanes that we have in the city. Most of Amsterdam and many cities in the Netherlands has like separate protected cycle lanes. And A lot of the process of urban development in the city has been sort of expanding these protected bike lanes, and that's very popular. People like this. And that's partly because we are so used to having the role of bikes being supreme in this city. I'm actually learning to drive in Amsterdam at the moment. I don't know if I even told you that, but...
I want to see you park along a canal with none of the guardrails.
Now, funnily enough, they don't let you do that while you're still learning. But you do talk about bikes from moment one, basically. Bikes are on everyone's mind. But this is also my thing, which is that it's better for cars as well. Like, I initially learned to drive in London, took my test twice, failed it twice, old news. But people think I'm crazy for wanting to drive in Amsterdam because of all the bikes. But because there are so many bikes, it's really chill. It's really ordered and efficient, and you can never go that fast, but it's a very dense city, so that doesn't really matter. But to get back more directly to your question on the role of bikes, I don't think bikes are a political issue in the Netherlands, really at all. I think that people kind of remember, in activist circles, kind of remember the bike protests, and certainly they make up part of the story of Amsterdam. There's a famous guy here called the Flower Bike Man who decorates bikes with flowers, and he talks about the role of cycling in his life, etc. But I think that activists aren't super concerned with it because it does work quite effectively at a policy level, and other issues have become more pressing, like housing.
Yeah, that would be more pressing to me if I lived there. I mean, as an outsider looking in, it does appear to work.
The thing is, it's hard to know where to go from here, in part because it is the best place in the world for cycling. Some people think that Copenhagen has taken the throne, but I've never been to Copenhagen, but been trying to build a theory of which is the better cycling city at this time. And for a while, I thought Copenhagen had taken the throne, but my understanding now is that if you are a visitor to the city, then Copenhagen makes a lot more sense. But if you live there, then Amsterdam still sort of, once you get used to the little quirks of it, it sort of still beats out Copenhagen. Maybe.
You've chosen a point that is impossible to debate, so kudos to you. And when I say that from an outside perspective, it appears to work, I think you can attest to this as well, because you came to visit me 2.5 years ago. And the town I live in now, I won't say the name, but it's within the San Diego region. And we were driving down some roads. And at least in 2022, I believe, it was like the second deadliest city in the country per capita for cyclists.
Really?
Which there are not many
that you're in.
Yes.
Wow.
When we were driving down these roads, because it is suburby near the coast, and there are a lot of 55 plus mile an hour roads here, just regular roads, not highways or anything. And in the US, you're not allowed to ride a bicycle on the sidewalk, even if no one is walking on the sidewalk, because these are in business parks and on these main roads where people do not walk. There are bicycle lanes on the side of the road, and I showed Adam this. I said, what do you think of our bicycle infrastructure, knowing he'd have a visceral reaction? Can you tell them what this bicycle lane was compared to your Dutch protected lanes?
So for those of you who may not know, what we have in the Netherlands is you have a road, like a single lane road usually, then you have like a little tiny strip of sidewalk, then a flat bit of very, very smooth tarmac that's the cycle lane, and then the sidewalk like next to that. So you have these kind of three things going on, and these are in very compact cities, mind you, very narrow spaces. The sidewalk is usually not really big enough to be a sidewalk, but that's a different issue. In this nameless Southern Californian town, you had like a 3-lane road, and in between lane 2 and 1 there were 2 lines painted sort of about a meter apart from each other, with a bike painted in between them, and that was the cycle lane. It was a little bit of paint in between 2 lanes of a 3-lane road where you could go 55 miles an hour.
It's either that, or it's basically in the guttering of the street on the side. And Adam was appalled, rightfully so. And then a few months later, I sent him a picture because I said, hey, look, they fixed it. They fixed the bike lanes. And do you remember what they
put
did
up like
fix
these
it?
Plastic kind of bollards, right? Like these little plastic sticks.
Well, okay, so they did that in a few sections where I think people had died.
Oh my god, okay.
And those can easily be run over by a car. But what they did to the bike lanes in this town is they painted that strip, the 1 meter strip, green. And I said, all right, problem
I
solved.
don't think
Adam.
I even registered that as a change. I thought you were just reminding me of it.
Well, that's the extent of bicycle infrastructure we have here. I'm sure there are other cities around the country that have bicycle infrastructure. Davis, California comes to mind because it's basically a university town that doesn't have anything else in it. So they built these bicycle highways going around the town. But other than that, the world is playing catch up to Amsterdam and Copenhagen.
Yeah.
So that's my experience with bikes and why I don't have one.
I don't have a bike. I bought a bike yesterday, actually.
Did you buy it from a guy walking with...
No, not like in Ted Lasso. No, I didn't. Those don't actually exist. That's not real. But I bought it from a guy who owns a vintage store, and he had these beautiful Dutch racing bikes from the 1970s, like steel-framed road bikes.
We'll check in how long he has it before it's taken from the parking garage.
Parking garage? What parking garage? We have the street. As fun as it was to talk about bikes, and as much as I love cycling infrastructure, it's maybe my favourite thing about living in Amsterdam. That's sort of not really the point of this episode that I wanted to drive home. The thing that I want to drive home and that I want to sort of leave the listener with is the idea of this sort of diversity of tactics, this plurality of tactics. Yes, there's a debate to which were more effective or the order they had to happen in, but what are some of the things that you take away from this whole saga, Sam? Or that you would like the listener to take away?
Collaboration is key, because it wasn't just the radicals in the Netherlands that pushed this, but it was them that drew eyeballs, and it was up to the working professionals that saw these young people, saw the more radical wings of this movement, and they listened, and they sought how they could implement this change on a professional level for their society. So I think that the intersectionality across our societies and cultures is really key in why they were able to succeed. Another thing that stands out at the end there is just that there's always work to be done. Just because you've gotten something to a good level doesn't mean that it can't be a great level.
So I think that last bit is really key for me, like celebrate your victories, but don't take your eye off the ball. And while I agree that broad collaboration is really important, there are some specific tactics that I think are really useful that can be good to bear in mind for any future organising. One is, regardless of how effective it is as a long-term strategy, and regardless of the country that you live in, I think having a good knowledge of the workings of the political structure in your area can be really useful, because it can give you insight into how to apply pressure to the various levers of power. And I think that then creating, when you have things that you want people to do, making it easy for them is also super important. Like the Dutch Cycling Union basically sent how-to guides to all of their branches in different areas of the Netherlands, which included this local political knowledge. And then don't take your eye off the ball.
That's very important advice. I think in our countries of birth, the pressure on politicians sometimes can seem like it's only in the form of monetary pressure. So maybe part of what we do here is explore other possibilities, potentially. But I think, there are good lessons to learn. And I'm seeing that in action a little bit nowadays. It took a bit of momentum to get started, but you see a lot of people handing out flyers, just leaving them around of what to say to an ICE agent if you are stopped here in America, an immigration officer, and what your rights are. And you see a lot of solidarity with people today trying to combat the growing authoritarianism in my own country through the knowledge that some have, and trying to spread that knowledge to people that might not have that.
I think these are very solid things to keep in mind. And I think that's a good place to leave it. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here, Sam?
Maybe I'll get a bike.
You should do it, man.
Then again, I don't know if I want to be part of that statistic in this town, Adam.
Move to Amsterdam, buy a bike. Two problems solved.
Yeah, there we go. Good plan. Everyone should follow.
Actually, please no one move to Amsterdam. We do not have enough housing.
Move out of Southern California. Go to Amsterdam, please. Our housing is too expensive here.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for chatting with me here today. Thank you, listener, for listening. I hope you had a good time. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. And I hope you keep fighting the good fight. To finish us off here, Sam, could you take us away with a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle?
When spirits are low, when the day appears dark, when work becomes monotonous, and hope hardly seems worth having. Just mount a bicycle and go out for a good spin down the road, without anything but thought for the ride you are taking.